This is IBM Museum, and I don't know how long this video will be. We have another unboxing in front of us. I do know it came in, so I'm going to get turned around and start opening up this package. Now, I do have items out here on the bench that I'm going through to have available for what I anticipate. I'm trying to make sure that I do have everything I need. I've gone through and masked off any addresses, but this is from someone I've interacted with and went through and have gone through troubleshooting steps with other items that were sent to me, mainly those MFM controllers. There was a bad MFM controller that was sent to me. I went through to test it, of course, and quickly determined it was bad, and sent back a good MFM controller, and actually got one of the systems that he had functional, and that was this Model 60 planar. And I will go through and pull this out just to kind of show. I do have a spare planar over here. I've got CPUs, I've got RAM. We'll take a look at what we've got, what the needed items would be. This does have some, we'll say that's anti-static bag. And it does have some rather odd labels on items here. But this is a Model 60 planar, 16-bit microchannel. Okay. And we've got the ports on the back. Looks to be in real good shape. Just some odd things over the label. Power supply, keyboard controller chip. Crystal looks... I'll be doing a little bit of visual identification first. And the diskette drive controller, the SIMs sockets, which are empty, but that is no big deal at all. I do have some spare SIMs right here, the 256 KB. Goes through the ROM BIOS, 4 chips in this case, and both the E and F segment in this case, and these, they're interleaved in pairs for the E and F segment. And IBM did that to gain space for the A BIOS, the advanced BIOS, that was with OS2, operating systems like OS2 would use. And then there's also the C BIOS, the compatibility BIOS, the BIOS that earlier systems had. So there is the 286 CPU present. I do have spares of those anyway. The 287 FPUs, optional. We're not going to really worry about it in this case. Of course, the speaker battery connector, and we'll need one of these for configuring. I do have one of those out with a fresh battery. I've got batteries elsewhere, but that thing is brand new. So we have the bus connectors, starting from slot 1 at the bottom, going up through. We just have one unusual slot out of the bunch that has the AVE, the auxiliary video extension, on the back. There is base VGA on there, but if you had an adapter like the 8514/A or another video adapter that was the auxiliary video adapter, this portion of the bus is basically coupled with that primary video to be able to work in tandem with it, to be able to interact or even use functions as it is. Like the 8514/A adapter was vectored graphics. It didn't have any base VGA functions on it, but that connector portion gave it access to do that. There's the RAM DAC for the VGA. This is the VGA chip here. There is video RAM or VRAM that's right here. And of course, you have the serial connection, the parallel port, which, we've got our parallel port postcode reader, and I've also got the microchannel postcode readers. The mouse and keyboard, we're going to use the mouse port for power in this case of that parallel port postcode reader, if we happen to use it, and we'll have the keyboard plugged in. There is a keyboard fuse here. I mean, sometimes these can blow, but we've got a meter to check continuity. The way I understand it is there's not any response in video from this planar. And although that can mean a lot of halt codes before video is displayed, they don't have a postcode reader to go a little bit further with this and determine if there may be a fault that may be fixable. We're going to go through just to briefly scan. I mean, the board, this is the CMOS with that non-volatile RAM, and that little loop there is very typical bodge wire for the MUL 60. I think my other MUL 60 planers have it. This PCB in particular is green. It's the color that I typically see with the MUL 60 planers. I don't know if I've ever seen one in brown. They do have, interesting that IBM put spare mounts for chips if they needed them. And the RAM DAC itself is ceramic, which is typical of an earlier planar or pairing with a particular VGA chip. I don't really know. I'd have to inventory my MUL 60 that I have. And I made the photo today upon saying that this arrived. I took the picture of my 5 working complete MUL 60s. And when I say working, I mean there's diskette drives that are not functional, but those systems have hard drive controllers. Even one unit with the ESDI drive, it actually has 2 drives. With the ESDI controller, has 2 drives on it. And there are MFM models and ESDI models. So we're going to go through and test this. As I say, I've got the another planar to go through and do a comparison, as it were, if it need be. Going through and plugging this in, I'd like to go through and use one of the microchannel. We have the MC Mechanic, and I actually have this set to the alternate address still, which is not a real critical thing. The MUL 60 doesn't display postcodes on that alternate port, the kind of the subroutines or anything like that. I might go through to where I have one of the ones I have on interposer, and I'll have to determine for how it is facing here that an orientation that'll be visible, or to go through and to use this on the interposer, since this presents in this orientation, actually presents quite a bit to the postcodes. I'm not even going to go through and initially plug in any of the RAM And I may go through to the point of just pulling it up on the background display. And I intended even to have something better that I was working on Mall 60 planar, whatever. I can move my knife off to the side. I'm finished with it. And I may come up with an orientation, maybe something like this, so that the postcode codes are visible from that. Of course, I have my little okay, all of a sudden, that doesn't want to keep in position. That's fine. Okay, and going through to, I've got at least lengthy enough of cables here to work with. I can probably go through, just in case I get video, I'll have it on the back. I do have video capture, but I'm probably not going to initially move from beyond using the camcorder on that. I don't really need to change the scene around otherwise. For the tangled cables I have here, we will go through and get that connected. Okay. Now the power supply itself is going to be probably the most interesting aspect here. This cable is typically not flexible enough. It just doesn't want to work with me a lot of the time. I had a big length of sticky tape here and it's stuck to itself. Okay. I don't know if that's any more visible, but the now for the diskette drive, we'll initially have that unconnected as well. I'll keep the power cord handy. And just, it's a really tall assembly here with the planar and power supply and that the lengthy cords. In fact, maybe that's something that someone needs to do, is to build an extension for this. I could go through if I wasn't, if I had like a spacer, I could go through and have that in. And this one actually has a pretty good, and this is a white switch power supply. We're going to have a little bit of debate for the live stream this upcoming Saturday for my regular scheduled live stream. And that is off. We will plug in power. Okay. I think I'm halfway situated for where I want to be in this instance with the postcode readers, video, of course, especially with, or actually without RAM. I don't expect any video in this case at this point. Just get the mouse off to the side. So let's go through. Now, missing RAM. Okay. I want to make sure I have this on the micro channel interposer for this one, and I want to make sure that we are still set. In fact, I think we're set to an all or a 680 maybe. Let's take a look. So we've got 4 on, and so that is to the all position. We could go through to the just the 680, which is also position 1 being on, but we weren't seeing anything really at all there. And of course, as I say, we do not have RAM. And we're not seeing the parallel port. We're just seeing that stop at that 00 and the 82. Now, there's the first few tests that run postcode wise. We'll switch it off. We're actually going to go through and disconnect power. You know, the CPU is the first thing that runs through a check. And then it typically from there goes through. In fact, that CPU, I was expecting that thing to be tighter in. Here's the 286 CPU, just like the ones I have. And we could do a 10 megahertz. We could do a swap straight up, but I want to see, you want to check orientation. The clipped corner is towards the camcorder. In other words, it's the angled corner here. All the other corners are squared off. And that's a pin 1 indication. And I think that is a little bit tighter on tighter in the socket. Still nothing. Same. And normally if it were something like the BIOS checksum or something like that, and that would be like bit rot in the chips, you'd see at least some turnover initially as the CPU passed. And the pins on this are very straight. We want to, of course, check the orientation again. Oh, and you know what I'm not doing? One connection, and we could have gone through and checked from, didn't have the speaker and the battery connected. So if we get a reaction, we might revert to the initial CPU. Okay. Again, no reaction. Looks to be the same codes. Now for these 256 KB, and I'm going to put them in there just because to kind of get a complete Okay, so we've got sims in there. I don't expect any change. And certainly we don't have any. So what is the next step? Well, we go through, we have a spare planar, same BIOS version for the MUL 60. I'll have to check the ROM page, but I think there's only the this particular BIOS version. These labels. So that's the 90X7429. Let's go through. Say if I'd had a nice little pretty picture, a banner of to say what this video was, it'd be nice for my little background monitor. That's why I put it in place. I still need to go through and work with its mounting. Now this is going to be a, it's a delicate enough process that we want to do as we go through. And this is nice. It's, one of the spare model 60 planers that I have. Okay, there's the labeling on it. 7429. So despite the marking, and those are both AMD ROMs. And we want to go through, and of course, we're very careful on pin 1 orientation, but we're going to swap them one at a time. Now, I could go through and take the originals and reseat them. And there's a method to my madness here. I'm going to go through just to not be confused or anything like that. I'm going to go through and put them in the other planar. And I don't know, I'm going through in an order. I don't know if I'm working with the set that's in the E segment. I mean, normally it would be the compatibility BIOS section that that have the base postcode functions for startup. And that's why IBM had to preserve the C BIOS. Besides, just people going through and using their MUL 60s with DOS in the DOS environment, it was only pretty much OS2 at the time that used the A BIOS. To these. Delicate process of making sure all the, the pins are straight. It goes into the socket fine. And we have the pin 1 orientation. Just going through one by one. I'm talking about being careful, and that also includes putting these EPROMs in carefully. If you think that it's not going in correctly, I always like to double check. I always rake a fingernail across that notch that's in the end of the chip, just to be doubly sure in my mind of where I am I make sure I have that pin 1 orientation correct before I power it on. I mean, I've only fried one ROM chip one time, and it was a Tribble, and it was actually the late model version of the SCSI microcode on that Tribble. And I was so depressed, and luckily it had been captured elsewhere. I was worried I only had one chip of it, and I had gone through and just trying to read. And I think I maybe even put it in the EEPROM reader backwards. Okay, and we're not seeing a change so far. I mean, these EEPROMs, they can get, and especially to the point where when you're taking them out, and I'm using a tool like that to go through and extract these. Some people, I mean, I use a little flat bladed small screwdriver for years too. But there can be some chemical, the difference in metals, how it goes through and just in use, just bonds over the years that really can go through and bind these up in the sockets. And so, it's just a little bit of patience. And inserting them in the correct way is just as important as getting them out safely. Okay, and we have no change so far. We are down to the last EEPROM. And normally you can see, sometimes where like a checksum error, which the post routine does go through. It will have its own, it has its own postcode for that if it's able to get that far with a corrupted ROM. Okay. And then, so we're down to all of the ROMs swapped. Okay. And still no change. So that's the easy part of the process so far, or the 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 steps of going through and swapping the parts that we could. The 286 CPU, I mean, it feels that it is getting operational temperature. Okay, we're going to go through and, unfortunately, the keyboard controller is solder in place, but that's how most Model 60s are anyway. Well, all PS2s, except the Type 3 Model 80. Okay. I do have the meter to go through and check continuity. But this planar looks to be visually complete. Although it could be, you know, some of the critical chips in that chipset going bad. The, you know, it could be something of the oscillator for the CPU. Now that's going to be for something else. I don't know on the, in fact, let's do this. So get myself back on this screen and we will go through to pull up this is the Model 60 page at the Arden tool. And I will give a link in the video description for that. Here's the planar diagram, and it will identify components. I'm interested in that Y1. There can be things like the CPU crystal, which is okay. So it looks among the selections, it's in the lower left-hand corner is the oscillators. And as I say, the 286 CPU is run at a frequency of 10 megahertz in this case. And I believe that to be the Y3 crystal. And it is divided by 4 for that 40 megahertz. It would then be divided by 4. But there it is. In fact, I've got the helps if I do the make sure I have the full field of view. So that is the CPU crystal most likely there. And it goes through, you know, chipset, things like that. The back looks good. I mean, there's not any gouges or anything else that stands out. And I think it was where there's something on the, and it was kind of a normal thing that was being swapped out on the planar, and then just all of a sudden it died. And so they had a second Model 60 planar, and so they just sent me this to go through and check out. Not really anything as a further process of going through and sending back a good planar. Although I do have that capability. So in this case, and of course we swapped out the original RAM. Here's what we can do as well. I mean, we kind of know we swapped the ROMs, and then we also, this planar has the CPU that I haven't done anything for swapping the CPU on this one. I could go through and along with swapping out known good components to a planar that doesn't respond, you can also go through and swap out the bad pieces that came off a planar to, the one that you're testing, to a known good planar to go through and make sure that those components work, because there also can be more than one thing wrong. And for this, I'm kind of in a suspicion that, and we'll set it off over here to the side, bad planar that we weren't able to get any response from. I mean, and as I say, I could have gone through and checked fusing and things like that, but that's typically not going to have a to make the system not respond at all for the fusing. Okay, so we've got the postcard there. We've got the parallel postcode card, parallel port postcode reader in there as well. I haven't changed any settings otherwise to those. This is with the original EPROMs of that unit. So this would be a way to go through and to make sure that okay. Now we didn't have a I don't have the diskette drive or anything like that connected. It's going to complain about that. The 601 is the diskette drive. We hear beeps. We saw indications on for the postcodes of this planar that I had. So this would be able to go through and normally this would have, I could have gone through the steps to press F1 and ended up in the ROM basic. Would have been perfectly fine for a test. That the system works. I mean, just mainly just seeing these postcodes when there isn't any video, just to start to see these things turn over in that first few seconds. That is the critical aspect with this, with going through and troubleshooting and knowing if you have to go further. With the reference diskette, again, give it time. The first time it loads, it's going to take some time to go through beyond just the blinking cursor as it loads the diskette drive. I mean, it's got the access light and this diskette drive. I mean, I've had it marked as bad in the past. I've had it remarked good. Yeah. And so it might be the diskette drive. This has run good for me before. Or it could even be an aspect of the diskette drive controller on this. The chip. And that's what I would do before I go through and send out a replacement planar. If the occasion where I was trying to hear noises, I didn't It's probably just me with the CPU extractor. I would verify that the planar that I'm sending back, works and goes through, and with a known good diskette drive. Now I'll have to go through and test this diskette drive um, back in the other system, and maybe even encounter to where it's got a bad diskette drive controller or something else being an aspect to this. I don't think I think my diskette, my reference diskette is still good as well, because I've just ran that the other day. But yeah, that access light, and it's just not liking that diskette at all. But we are seeing a reaction. This diskette drive has been good for me before, but it's also been bad at times before for me too. And I'm not seeing the access light on it now. It's just saying, nope. So, okay, there I'm manually doing F1. Okay, and this is going to go to where it throws us into ROM Basic. Something more, again, to check. But as far as the other functions of this planar, looks like they work, and it, especially for the BIOS chips I have on here. That looks to be good. I'm going to go through, and just to make sure that it's not. And this CPU, I mean, this is its normal operating temperature of the 286 CPU. I'm feeling this being warmer. I mean, I think it's the normal operating temperature. It just is being, it's warmer than what the CPU on the bad planar was being run at. And so here's the original CPU. Make sure that pin 1 orientation, make sure that no pins bend or flex as you go through and get that in. Okay, and that has a reaction with the host codes. Okay. And I'll get thrown over to ROM Basic here in a moment, I think, with another F1 press. Give me the graphic. And there I'm in ROM Basic. So the there is just something else to this planar, and I would even suspect the CPU crystal, which would be enough of 4-pin that we can go through and put a socket there and check with another crystal. I have oscope related stuff that I could go through, and I need to start checking waveforms and things like that. Um, but it could be, these any portion of these chipsets as well. The going through, we're going to do one final case of swapping things, swapping that bad planar back in. We see the same voltages from the power supply unit to run another planar. So we know that it is good. We're just trying to like with like replacement. And I'm going to do the parallel port postcode reader. This thing is getting twisted. And so we have there on the planar here, we have the original 286 that came with that bad planar, the original BIOS. I had separate SIMs. They went through and plugged in. We'll have this off to the side. So I remember that it is which one it is. And well, excuse me, that's the working play. I need to go through and test the diskette drive a little bit more to know that it and then we're plugging the original planar that I received in the mail back in right now. Going through because I want to do by temperature by feel. Yeah, that's definitely running. That's not the operational temperature. I mean, I feel some temperature there, but it's not to the point. And these crystals can get knocked around and things like that, and all sorts of things there. But I think the temperature's coming up slightly, but yeah, that's not okay. There, I feel it getting warmer. And of course, this is a different 286 CPU since the original CPU is over here on this other planar. This is one that I've swapped in. We aren't seeing, in fact, the diskette drive light on this is constant on. And chips, you want to make sure that it's nothing that's extremely hot. I can't remember the indicator lights. Yeah, and the temperature on that CPU came up a little bit better. Temperature there. So this is going to be a continuing level with going through and trying to figure out what this, if this planar is repairable. And I'll of course go through and mark it, and could be to the point where it may be a good candidate for a salvage operation to go through and look at the chips, even maybe to try and swap out the chips if we had a donor chips that we knew were good or whatever. But these IBM chips are, they're going to be, there's not a market for those things out there. That's really a thing. And as I say, this person that sent this to me, they have another Mul 60 planar that they were able to put in and get functional. I'll go through and see if I can narrow it down a little bit more to what it might have been. But now I've got, in addition to the 5 working Mul 60s, I've got the 5 working planars and 1 non-working. And this actually puts more questions in place now than what I had, because that diskette drive action as I went through, and it going through and not reading the diskette. And the last time I went through and used this drive, in fact, on a complete system, I remember the drive going through and working, being functional for me. But I may be mixed up with that, and I need to really go through and retest all my diskette drives and go through and mark good, bad, otherwise for that too. So I know I'm grabbing onto good items when I go through these tests, even though I didn't get that far at all with this planar. This is something that's really fundamentally wrong that prevents us even from starting to turn over postcodes or something. So just keep in touch. I will go through and do updates from there. As I say, I'm going to do the link for the Mul 60 so people can look over the planar and things like that, that diagram that's there at the Ardent tool. And you're always free to comment a little bit more. I think I touched all the bases I needed to do in this case, but I'm always open to comments and people telling me of something I could have done. And in case you like this video, enjoyed the content that I'm showing here, go ahead and click on that like button. And as always, subscribe to my channel if you've not done so already. But this is IBM Museum. That's all I have for now. Thank you.